A life rarely falls apart all at once. It usually happens little by little, every time you postpone an important decision, neglect a priority, or let the day decide for you. You keep working, meeting your responsibilities, taking care of things. From the outside, nothing may seem particularly wrong, but small warning signs begin to pile up. Unfinished tasks you avoid looking at, commitments you no longer remember why you accepted, hours that disappear without leaving anything meaningful behind, conversations you need to have, and decisions you keep putting off. Then a very understandable temptation appears, trying to fix everything at once. A new routine, more discipline, more goals, a different schedule. But adding more things to a life that is already overloaded can actually increase the very disorder you are trying to correct. Getting back on track does not mean controlling every aspect of your life. It means learning again to distinguish what deserves your attention, what truly depends on you, and what behavior you can begin changing today. These 10 practices are designed to work on exactly that, from different angles. And one of the final practices is especially worth remembering. It only takes a few minutes at the end of the day, but it allows you to see whether you are actually living according to what you say matters, or whether, without realizing it, you are once again allowing the day to choose for you. Let's begin with something even more basic. Practice 1. Audit what actually depends on you. When several areas of life seem to become complicated at the same time, it is easy to throw everything into the same category. A problem at work, a relationship going through a difficult period, an unexpected bill, a family member's behavior, a decision someone else still has not made, a concern about something that might happen 3 months from now. All of it weighs on you, but not all of it allows for the same kind of response. Imagine coming home after a difficult day. During dinner, you are still thinking about a decision that someone else at work has to make. Then you remember a family conversation that did not go the way you wanted. Later, you look at an unpaid bill and end the day with the feeling that too many things in your life are out of place. That feeling is real. The mistake begins when you treat all of those situations as though they require the same kind of action from you. Some require a decision from you. Others require a conversation. Some simply require you to wait until you have more information. And others belong entirely to another person's will. A useful practice is to stop and separate them. You can do it with 4 simple questions. What is actually happening? What part of this can I decide? What specific action is mine to take? What part will remain outside my control, even if I do everything correctly? The distinction may seem basic, but it changes the way you spend your energy. If a decision at work depends on someone else, perhaps you can prepare your part well, ask once when the time is appropriate, and then continue with your work. Checking your email 15 times does not give you any more control over the decision. If there is a conversation you need to have with someone close to you, waiting for the other person to somehow guess what is bothering you is not entirely outside your control either. You can decide how to express yourself, when to do it, and what boundary you need to communicate. What you cannot decide is how the other person will respond. This does not mean becoming indifferent to what you cannot control. Something can matter deeply to you and still refuse to obey you. That is one of the most useful distinctions in Stoic thought. Responsibility does not mean omnipotence. The purpose of this audit is to avoid both extremes, neither trying to control what belongs to other people, nor calling something fate when you are actually avoiding a decision you could make. Use this practice whenever everything starts to feel mixed together. Write down the specific issues you are dealing with and place, next to each one, the next action that truly belongs to you. If there is no reasonable action you can take right now, acknowledge that too. Sometimes getting back on track begins in a very unremarkable way, by stopping the waste of energy where you have no steering wheel and using that energy where you can still turn. But even after separating what depends on you from what does not, another problem appears. You may know perfectly well where your attention should go and still have a life so full of noise that you cannot keep it there. Practice 2. Remove noise before adding discipline. When we feel like we are losing control of our days, we usually think about what is missing. I need to wake up earlier. I need to read. I need to meditate. I need to exercise. I need to organize the week better. I need a new app, a better planner, or a stricter system. But before asking what you need to add, it may be more useful to look at what is already taking up the space. Think about an ordinary afternoon. You finish a task and check your phone for a few minutes. A message appears, then a news story, then something else you were not even looking for. By the time you return to what you were doing, 20 minutes have passed. Later, it happens again. At the end of the day, you have not necessarily rested, but you have not truly concentrated either. The problem is not only the time that was lost. Every interruption forces you to rebuild an intention that was already in motion. And noise does not always come through a screen. It can mean accepting meetings that do not require your presence, keeping commitments simply out of habit, leaving small obligations open that nobody actually asked you to take on, being constantly available for other people's problems, having 5 active projects when 2 would be enough. Trying to compensate for all of that by adding a strict routine can simply become another burden. That is why this practice works in the opposite direction. Before adding something, remove something. You do not need to completely clean up your entire life. Choose one specific source of noise and reduce it for 1 week. Maybe your phone does not come into the room while you work. Maybe you stop checking the news several times a day. Maybe you cancel a commitment you have kept only because you never stop to reconsider it. Perhaps you group certain replies into one specific time of day instead of living in a state of constant availability. The difficulty comes when we confuse elimination with irresponsibility. This is not about disappearing, ignoring your obligations, or making life artificially simple. Some responsibilities will remain. A family, a job, or someone who depends on you is not noise, simply because they require effort. Noise is whatever consumes your attention without being meaningfully connected to what you have decided deserves that attention. And this is where the first practice begins to support the second. Once you have distinguished what depends on you, you can see more clearly where you are using that ability. Removing one source of noise will not solve every problem in your life, but it creates something many people try to obtain directly through discipline: space. And when space appears, it becomes harder to avoid an uncomfortable question. What are you going to do with it? Practice 3. Define your non-negotiable minimums for difficult days. The space you recover is not very useful if it only works when everything is going well. There are weeks when you have enough time, energy, and room to cook better, exercise, clean the house, read, work with focus, and spend time with the people who matter to you. And then there are weeks when one bad night, a family problem, or a pileup of work makes everything start falling apart. On those days, a common mistake appears. Thinking that because you cannot do something well, there is no point in doing it at all. You cannot work out for an hour, so you do nothing. You cannot prepare the perfect meal, so you eat whatever is available. You do not have time to clean the entire house, so you allow the mess to keep growing. You cannot solve an important problem, so you also fail to take the small step that was still within reach. The result is that one difficult week ends up dragging down habits that never needed to disappear in the first place. That is why it helps to establish a minimum version of the things that keep your life steady. Not the ideal, the minimum. Maybe it means walking for 15 minutes when you cannot exercise any longer than that. Cleaning a single surface when you do not have time to deal with the whole house. Preparing the most important task of the day, even if everything else remains unfinished. Going to bed at a reasonable time, even though you did not finish everything you wanted to complete. The key is for the minimum to be small enough that you can maintain it under imperfect conditions and meaningful enough to keep you from completely losing direction. This is not about permanently lowering your standards. A minimum is not the level you aspire to. It is the floor you try not to fall beneath. There is an important difference between discipline and rigidity. Rigidity demands that the day adapt to the plan. Discipline allows you to adapt the plan without abandoning what matters most. You can write down 3 or 4 minimums for the areas that tend to deteriorate most when you are overwhelmed. Sleep, movement, order, work, nutrition, contact with important people. You do not need to turn this into another complicated system. Its value appears precisely when life becomes difficult, because getting back on track does not mean always being capable of living as your best possible self. It means knowing what to preserve when you cannot do everything. And this leads to another, less visible form of disorder. Sometimes it is not our biggest responsibilities that overwhelm us. It is the number of small, unfinished matters that we keep carrying around mentally. Practice 4. Close one open loop every day. Some tasks take 10 minutes and occupy your mind for 3 weeks. Replying to an email, making an appointment, reviewing a document, confirming a date, deciding whether to accept an invitation, returning something you bought, having a short conversation you have been postponing for days. None of those things seems important enough to stop everything and deal with immediately. But they do not disappear either. You remember them while driving. They appear while you are trying to concentrate on something else. You think about them again before going to bed. You may even feel a small wave of irritation every time you see the object, message, or note that reminds you the matter is still unresolved. Not every open loop needs to be closed immediately. Some decisions require time. Some conversations should be prepared for. Some processes depend on other people. The practice is to distinguish those situations from the things that remain open simply because you do not want to tolerate a few minutes of discomfort. Choose one matter a day. One, not 10, and close it in whatever way is appropriate. Closing something does not always mean getting the result you wanted. Sometimes it means sending the message, saying no, making the appointment, making a decision, archiving something you have decided not to continue, asking directly instead of continuing to imagine possibilities. It can also mean consciously deciding that something will not be done. That matters. A task that remains indefinitely pending continues demanding attention. A task you have deliberately decided to abandon already has an answer. Imagine a list of 15 accumulated matters. Trying to resolve all 15 in one afternoon may produce more exhaustion than relief. But closing one every day slowly changes the underlying feeling. Not because life becomes free of problems, but because you begin proving to yourself that a concern can be turned into a concrete action. There is another useful consequence. As you close small, unfinished matters, you begin to see more clearly which issues are actually difficult. They are no longer hidden behind 20 minor details. You may then discover that the thing you have been avoiding for weeks does not require better organization. It requires a decision. And making decisions is not always difficult because we do not know what to do. Very often, the difficult part is tolerating what we feel during the few minutes just before we do it. That is where the next practice comes in. Practice 5. Deliberately delay your first reaction. Not every important decision arrives calmly on your calendar. Some arrive as a message that irritates you, a criticism you believe is unfair, a family comment that touches a sensitive nerve, or news that suddenly changes your plans. In those moments, the problem is usually not that we have no response. It is that the response appears too quickly. You read something and immediately start typing. You hear a sentence and you are already preparing your comeback. Someone disagrees with you and your body reacts before reflection has had a chance to begin. Sometimes you send the message and 5 minutes later, you start mentally writing the version you wish you had sent instead. Delaying your reaction does not mean suppressing it. It also does not mean tolerating disrespect or pretending to be calm. It means introducing a small amount of distance between what happens and what you choose to do with it. It can be as concrete as refusing to answer an important message while you are angry, walking into another room before continuing an argument, taking a short walk, writing the response and not sending it yet, waiting until you can explain what you think without unnecessarily escalating the conflict. Epictetus emphasized a distinction that remains practical today. An impression may appear immediately, but that does not mean you must immediately turn it into judgment and behavior. Applied to everyday life, it means that feeling the urge to respond does not obligate you to obey it. The difficulty is obvious. In some situations, waiting feels like weakness. We want to make something clear now, correct an injustice now, defend our position now. But speed and strength are not the same thing. A slower response can be much more precise. And waiting does not mean postponing forever. If a boundary needs to be expressed, express it. If you need to say no, say no. If a behavior requires consequences, take the appropriate action. The pause exists only to prevent a temporary emotion from choosing the tone, the words, and the magnitude of your response. You can turn this into a simple rule. The stronger your emotional activation, the less final your first action should be. That small delay protects more than a conversation. It protects your ability to decide who you want to be precisely in the moments when it is easiest to forget. Because a life can lose direction this way too. Not only through the major decisions we postpone, but through the small reactions we repeat until they become character. Practice 6. Decide what truly deserves your energy. After learning to delay a reaction, a more difficult question appears. If you are not going to respond to everything, what are you going to devote yourself to? Life also becomes disordered through excessive availability. Not always because there is not enough time, but because too many things are allowed into it. A phone call that could wait. A favor you accept without thinking. An argument where there is nothing new left to say. A responsibility nobody asked you to take on, but that you assumed out of habit. Someone else's concern that begins occupying more space than your own responsibilities. Sometimes we say we are exhausted when, in reality, part of that exhaustion comes from never deciding what deserves our energy and what does not. Imagine a week when you have an important project to finish. You know it requires several hours of uninterrupted focus. But every day, small demands appear. Reviewing something for a coworker, handling a minor family issue, answering messages that are not urgent, accepting an additional meeting. Individually, none of these things seems important enough to justify saying no. But together, they end up pushing aside the thing you had already decided mattered. The problem is not always generosity. Helping other people can be completely consistent with your values. Being available for someone important can be too. The problem begins when helping stops being a choice and becomes your automatic response to every request. Then your schedule no longer reflects your priorities. It reflects other people's ability to gain access to you. A simple practice is to avoid immediately answering requests that will require a meaningful amount of your time. Instead of automatically saying yes, use a much more modest sentence. Let me check. That pause gives you a chance to look at the week you actually have, not the imaginary week where everything somehow fits. Maybe you discover that you can help, but not today. That you can participate, but for 30 minutes rather than the entire afternoon. That there is one responsibility that truly belongs to you and another you are accepting simply to avoid the discomfort of saying no. Seneca often reflected on the value of time and how easily we allow other people to occupy it while protecting our other possessions much more carefully. You do not need to turn that idea into an obsession with making every minute productive. Time is also well spent resting, being with someone, going for a walk, doing something that produces nothing measurable. The question is not whether every hour produces something. The question is whether the way you spend that hour reasonably resembles the life you say you want to live. This practice can be uncomfortable because choosing means leaving things out. There is no priority without sacrifice. If everything is important, nothing gives direction. And once you begin protecting your energy more carefully, another difficulty appears. You can still look at your entire life and feel that there is too much left to fix. At that point, thinking 5 years ahead can actually make the feeling worse. Practice 7. Shrink the horizon when you feel lost. There are moments when thinking about your entire life is not very useful. You need to improve your finances, take better care of your health, resolve a work issue, clean the house, repair a relationship, make an overdue decision, recover habits you have abandoned. You look at the whole picture and it feels like too much. Then a very understandable kind of paralysis appears. Because you do not know how to fix everything, you do not start fixing anything. Shrinking the horizon means temporarily stopping the question, how am I going to fix my life? And asking instead, what reasonable decision can I make within the next few hours? Not the perfect tomorrow, not next year, today. Suppose you have neglected a financial issue for months. You have avoided checking your statements because you suspect you will not like what you find. Thinking about how to save money for the next 10 years may feel abstract and overwhelming. The next action may be much smaller. Open the accounts. Look at the actual numbers. Write down 3 expenses you need to review. That does not solve the problem, but it changes your relationship with it. You have moved from a vague concern to a defined action. The same applies to many areas of life. If you have not exercised in a long time, perhaps you do not need to design a complete training program today. You need to go for a walk. If a room has been messy for weeks, maybe you do not need to dedicate your entire Saturday to it. Start with one table. If you have a conversation you need to have, the first action may simply be deciding what you need to communicate in one sentence. Shrinking the horizon does not mean giving up long-term planning. Some decisions require vision, preparation, and patience. The practice is useful when the future has become so large that it no longer guides you. It paralyses you. In those moments, it helps to distinguish between a plan and an action. A plan may contain many steps. An action only needs to answer this question. What can I do right now that makes the next step a little clearer? There is something grounded about moving forward this way. You do not need to feel ready to change your entire life. You need to be present enough to take the next right action. And there is another extreme worth avoiding. Shrinking the horizon does not mean living without considering future consequences. You can make a decision today while thinking about next month. What you reduce is the psychological size of the task, not your responsibility. Every time you complete a concrete action, new information appears. Maybe the problem was smaller than you imagined. Maybe it was larger and you need help. Maybe you discover that you were trying to solve something that was not even a real priority. Action brings reality back to a mind that has spent too much time working with imagined scenarios. But there is a distinctly modern problem. You may know exactly what the next action is and still be unable to find a time to do it because nearly your entire day remains available for interruption. Practice 8. Take back 1 hour that currently belongs to everyone else. It does not have to be literally 1 full hour from the very first day. The idea is to reclaim a protected block of time, a period in which you are not responding to outside demands, unless there is a genuine reason to interrupt it. Many people have free time without having time that truly belongs to them. There is a difference. You can finish your workday and spend the next hour answering messages. You can wake up early and immediately give the first 40 minutes of your day to news, email, or social media. You can sit down to rest and still remain alert to every notification. The time exists, but your attention is still rented out. Imagine deciding to protect the time from 7 to 8 in the evening for something specific. Walking, reading, reviewing your finances, working on a project, or simply eating dinner without your phone. During the first few days, interruptions will probably appear. Some will be real. Others will only feel urgent because you are accustomed to answering immediately. It is important to be reasonable here. Someone with young children, a person caring for a family member, or someone who works on call does not have the same freedom as someone else. The practice does not demand a perfect hour or a rigid routine. It asks you to identify what part of your availability can stop being automatic. Maybe it is 30 minutes. Maybe 2 mornings a week. Maybe the first half hour after you wake up. The goal is not to produce more. It is to experience what happens when part of the day belongs to you again. Because once you recover that space, things that previously had nowhere to happen can begin to happen. You can think through a decision without interruption. Read more than 3 pages in a row. Walk without answering messages. Prepare something you have been postponing. Even allow yourself to become a little bored. And that boredom can also be useful. When there is no immediate stimulus available to fill the space, thoughts begin to surface that had been buried underneath the noise. Not all of them will be pleasant. You may remember a decision you are still avoiding. You may notice that you are tired. You may discover that you were filling certain moments precisely because you did not want to sit with a particular concern. There is no need to dramatize it. The space did not create those issues. It simply stopped hiding them. Up to this point, we have been recovering room in our lives, separating what we can control, removing noise, protecting minimums, closing unfinished matters, delaying reactions, choosing where to spend energy, shrinking the horizon, and reclaiming our own time. But something important is still missing, because an orderly life is not built only by avoiding mistakes. From time to time, we also need to see what happens when we deliberately choose a small discomfort instead of organizing our entire behavior around avoiding it. Practice 9. Choose a small discomfort before life chooses one for you. Part of personal disorder appears when we begin organizing too many decisions around avoiding every form of discomfort. We postpone a phone call because it may be uncomfortable. We put off an important task because it requires concentration. We always choose the easier option, even when we know it is not the better one. We avoid silence, waiting, effort, a difficult conversation, even a few minutes without stimulation. There is no need to turn this into an endurance test. The practice is simply to deliberately choose a small and useful discomfort. It might mean going for a walk, even when you do not feel like it, finishing a task before looking for entertainment, leaving your phone somewhere else during a meal, waiting a few minutes before satisfying an impulse that is not urgent, taking the stairs, sitting down to review financial accounts you have been avoiding, saying no to something you would otherwise accept merely to avoid a few moments of tension. Chosen discomfort has a purpose: to remind you that feeling resistance does not mean you have to obey it. That may sound simple, but it affects many decisions. If every time boredom appears you immediately search for distraction, boredom begins to control you. If every time guilt appears you surrender a reasonable boundary, guilt begins making your decisions. If every time effort appears you abandon a task, effort eventually determines what you are capable of sustaining. The Stoic tradition used forms of voluntary discomfort precisely to examine our relationship with the things we normally avoid or assume we cannot live without. You do not need to copy ancient practices literally. A useful modern version can be much simpler. Choose something that is safe, reasonable, and connected to a behavior you want to strengthen. This is not about being cold just for the sake of being cold. It is not about deliberately eating worse or turning discipline into punishment. Discomfort only has value if it increases your ability to choose. If what you are doing leaves you exhausted, irritated, or more rigid, you have probably lost the purpose of the practice. Start small. You may discover that you can tolerate more than you expected without turning it into some heroic achievement. And that experience has an important consequence. When a difficulty appears that you did not choose, it no longer feels completely unfamiliar. You have practiced something essential, remaining for a few moments with an uncomfortable feeling, without immediately running to eliminate it. But even this can become just another habit you practice for a few days and then forget. That is why one final practice remains. It does not add another major task. It allows you to look at all the previous practices from the outside and see whether they are actually changing the way you live. Practice 10. End the day by examining how you lived. At the end of an ordinary day, we usually remember what happened. What went well? What remains unfinished? The conversation that still bothers us? The mistake at work? The purchase we forgot to make? What we have to do tomorrow? But remembering the day is not the same as examining it. Examining it means taking a few minutes to look at your own behavior without turning that review into a trial against yourself. You can do it with 3 questions. What did I do today that is worth repeating? Where did I react in a way I would like to correct? What specific action do I want to handle better tomorrow? You do not need to write several pages. 3 lines may be enough. Imagine that while reviewing the day, you remember a conversation where you answered too quickly. You do not need to conclude that you are an impulsive person. You can observe something much more useful. Today, I responded before fully understanding what the other person was saying. Tomorrow, if it happens again, I will try to give myself a few seconds before answering. Perhaps you also notice that you protected an hour to go for a walk and that it helped. That is worth keeping. Maybe you realize that you spent most of the afternoon dealing with minor matters, while an important decision remained unfinished once again. That deserves a concrete action. This form of self-examination fits deeply with the spirit of Marcus Aurelius. Much of his reflection consists precisely of returning to his own behavior, correcting his judgment, and reminding himself how he wanted to live. You do not need to imitate his words or turn your evenings into a ceremony. The value lies in preventing each day from disappearing without leaving any lesson behind. There is a difference between feeling guilty about a mistake and using that mistake as information. Guilt can keep circling around something that has already happened. Reflection asks what you are going to do with it tomorrow. And there is also a difference between recognizing something you did well and simply taking it for granted. If today you set a boundary you needed, finished something you had been postponing for weeks, or prevented an impulsive reaction, recognizing that helps you identify the behavior you want to make more habitual. This is the practice that was especially worth remembering because it brings many of the others together. It forces you to look at where you spent your energy, what noise you allowed into your day, what matter you left unfinished, what reaction you obeyed, what priority you protected, and what small discomfort you were capable of tolerating, not in order to achieve a perfectly organized life, but to avoid living too many days without asking yourself where those days are taking you. A life can slowly fall into disorder. It can also begin to come back into order the same way. It usually does not happen through one dramatic decision. It happens through small corrections repeated often enough. Tomorrow, there may still be problems that do not depend on you. Interruptions will still happen. There will be days when you fail to maintain your minimums, react too quickly, or fill the space you had recovered with noise again. None of that invalidates the process. Getting back on track does not mean making sure everything stays under control. It means noticing sooner when you are drifting away from what you consider important and having a concrete practice that helps you return. At the beginning, we talked about that strange feeling of continuing to meet your responsibilities while something inside your life seems to have fallen out of order. Now that feeling can be looked at more precisely. Maybe you do not need to fix your entire life. Maybe you need to distinguish what depends on you. Remove something unnecessary. Maintain a minimum when the day becomes difficult. Close an unfinished matter. Delay a reaction. Protect your energy. Reduce the next step. Reclaim some of your own time. Tolerate a small discomfort. And then review what happened. You do not have to practice all 10 perfectly starting tomorrow. In fact, trying to do that could become another form of overload. Choose 2. Practice them for a few days. Then observe what changes. And every night before ending the day, return to that final review. Not to ask yourself whether you were flawless, Ask something more useful. Did the decisions I made today move a little closer to the direction I want to maintain? Because direction is not always lost when something extraordinary happens. Sometimes it is lost through hundreds of small decisions made without paying attention. And it can also be recovered there. In a response you choose to delay. In something you finally close. In an hour you decide to protect again. In a no you say at the right time. In one small action you take even though everything else remains unresolved. Tomorrow will bring another imperfect day. What matters is that it no longer has to decide everything for you. If you think this video could help someone, feel free to share it. This is Stoic Spirit. Until next time.